Thank you so much for participating, coming to the meeting today. My name is Julie Fisher. I'll be facilitating the meeting, and we've got speakers, and I so appreciate you taking your important time to come here. When I look in this room, I recognize there's just a wealth of experience, of commitment, of community, of knowledge. So I think my greatest goal of this meeting is to tap that and to listen. So what we have today is we're going to start with presentation, big picture, and then move in, dive deep into the issues right away. We've got 2 issues today. We'll do one, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll do the second. And after we have a short presentation on each issue, we'll have some table conversation. So we'll do some large group, and we'll definitely have some time for a Q&A after the initial presentation. How many folks is it your first meeting on the clear and objectives standards? So several. That's great. I think let people know that it's fine to come in and out of any of these 4 meetings, that they are standalone and there is an opportunity to get up to speed and participate no matter where you enter this process. I really would like to take a moment for everyone to introduce themselves. And by and large, we are going to use the mic, but for this moment, we're not going to because it's just too much running around. So I'm Julie Fisher, I'm with Cogito, and I'm working with the city. And just do your name and an affiliation, whether it's a neighborhood, a business, an organization, a community member, that's all good.
Yeah. Alyssa Hansen with the Planning Division.
Janessa Dragovich with the Planning Division.
Ed McMahon, Home Builders Association.
Rick Satry with Shermer Satry Group.
I'm Pam Waddell, I'm with Friendly Area Neighborhood Association.
Mary Yankovich, I'm with the Flower Community Organization.
I'm Bill Espergren with the South University Neighborhood Association.
I'm Jan Wassman with Overhill Valley Citizens.
Alexis Biddle with the Wildhousing Friends of Oregon.
I'm Paul Copy, former chair of JWN.
Kelly Osborne, League of Women Voters of Lincoln County.
Renee Clough, Branch Engineering.
Sorry.
Darcy Phillips, Cornerstone Community Housing.
Gwen Burkhardt, AARP.
John Fayetteville, Northeast Neighbors Neighborhood Association.
Nathaniel Kite, Fairmount.
Rob LeVert, Southwest Hills Neighborhood Association.
Kevin Reed with Northeast Neighborhood Association.
Lori Haber, Lane County Legal Aid.
Ash Wilson, I live in the southeast part of Eugene, and I'm a community member.
Rodney Bonner, planner, City of Eugene.
I'm Colin MacArthur. I'm a planner with Cameron McCarthy.
Dan Waller,
Carolyn Jacob, South University Neighborhood and Neighborhood Leaders Council.
Thomas Price, many hats, but I'll give you the Sustainability Commission this time.
Eric Beal, I'm in the board of the West Jefferson Neighborhood.
I'm Kelsey Labor, I'm with Cameron McCarthy.
And Karen Knudsen, architect and project lead for Better Housing Together.
And Amy. Oh, hi Amy.
New and Ridge with Springfield Farmer.
And Josh is doing the video tonight. We did put that in an email ahead of time, just making sure that we have the ability to share this with folks that couldn't be here tonight, and Rachel is taking notes. So the big picture goal, I'm gonna have Janessa and Alyssa talk too, but one thing you'll notice tonight as you start through the materials is you'll come to this input form and you'll look at it and you'll be like, wow, that's kind of structured. And you can blame me for that. The city staff said, no, Julie, we just need a blank page. We need this to be totally open. What are the concepts? How are we gonna solve these challenges of the code. And I said, you know, it is really hard for some folks to just do something out of nothing. Try hard, think of some ideas. It doesn't have to be everything, but just try. And so they did, and they wrote it down. And if you look at it and you feel upset by it, turn your page over. You get a blank page, it's fine. The other thing I did that is, it might be challenging, is I asked how strongly you feel about particular issues. If you don't even know how you feel, you do not need to answer that. But if you feel really strongly, I think it's important to know that sooner than later. So again, you can look to me for those things. And the most important thing is this is not a vote. We are not, you know, looking at numbers. What we're looking at is stakeholder groups, individuals, people impacted, and in general, we'll be looking at what different groups of people think. And in this room is a huge, huge knowledge, but there's some folks that are not here. And so look around and who's not here? Who's not here? Anyone want to reflect on that? Homeless people are not here. Who else is not here? It's a big one. Young people are not here, and they get to deal with this long after we're gone. I don't see anybody with an obviously challenged by a disability. We do not have many communities of color. So at the last meeting, we are working on identifying concepts and doing packages of concepts that will be outcomes. And it is my goal to elevate this to a broader audience towards the end. But today, we're looking at the technical stuff. So that October 23rd meeting, if you know people who are interested, but they're like, I don't know about all these meetings, tell them to come to the last. And the last thing I wanted to say is that this meeting is in a series. It's a total of 12 hours, 4 meetings. That seems like a lot to me. It seems like very little to me as well. I mean, it's never enough and it's always too much. My goal was to hit the middle ground. The more hours you meet, the fewer individuals participate. The fewer hours you meet, the more people you get. So we needed to hit that middle, and that was my goal in the number of meetings. So I'm just going to look at my notes here. The decision process is that the results of the 4 meetings will go to Planning Commission, and they will make a recommendation to City Council for next steps and sort of a preferred concept. So that's that will happen in November. And Vanessa and I will both talk to that as well. Thank you so much, and I'm going to pass it on. We'll have time for questions at the end of the PowerPoint.
Hi, I'm Janessa Dragovich, and I'm the project manager for the Clear and Objective Housing Approval Criteria Update, the longest title I think maybe in history. I'm going to refer to it often as Clear and Objective Update just because it's a mouthful. So a little bit about myself. I have lived around Eugene my entire life. I've never lived more than 25 minutes away from Eugene. I've been in 4 different parts. I've lived in southwest Eugene, I've lived in west Eugene, I've been in River Road, Santa Clara, and currently I'm in the Sheena neighborhood, I believe they call it the South Hills neighborhood. So I've been here all my life, I'm raising my family here, and I care a lot about Eugene. So that's a little bit about me. So now we're going to go into a little bit more about the background and kind of context for this project. So I'm gonna hand it over to Alyssa to talk about Envision Eugene and a little bit about the land use process, and then I'll come back and give you a little bit about the Clear and Objective project and where we're at with that.
I'll just introduce myself again. My name is Alyssa Hansen. I do see a lot of familiar faces out there, but for those of you who don't know me, I've been with the city for about 17 years, and I've done both current planning, reviewing development, as well as long-range planning, working on urban growth boundary issues and land use code amendments and whatnot. I've been in Eugene for over 25 years, and I've taken a tour of the town and lived in, I think, at least eight neighborhoods is what I've counted. I have made my home in Friendly, though, and I'm very happy there at this point. And what I've been asked to do tonight is to give you a little bit of context for where this project came from, and then provide a little bit of information about the land use process, as Janessa mentioned. So the Clear and Objective project, that is actually a project that implements Envision Eugene. And Envision Eugene is our community vision for guiding growth and change. For just a little backdrop, it started as a state mandate where we were required to figure out how we were going to establish our own urban growth boundary separate from Springfield, and how we were going to accommodate the next 20 years growth within that urban growth boundary. We took it as an opportunity as well to really create a vision for our city's future, for our very own city's future, and to think about how we wanted to accommodate this growth. So Envision Eugene was a long process, and it was very inclusive, and there were, I know a number of you have participated throughout that process. One of the things that came out of it is the 7 pillars, and these really summarize our community's vision. And these pillars also serve as guiding values for all the planning work that we do within the community. Again, they're the results of pretty extensive community visioning, and they really set the framework for our planning. They are really interrelated, and they need to be considered as a whole and seek balance. One thing I do want to point out about them, I think there's a little confusion, is they're not actually regulatory. So these aren't rules, these aren't regulations, they're not in our code, but they guide the planning work that we do. Also part of our vision is, the community's vision is this map, which shows our new urban growth boundary, including the expansion area for jobs up near the airport, as well as expansion area for parks and schools near the Bethel neighborhood, and then a parkland over in Santa Clara. It also shows, highlights our downtown, where we anticipate a fair amount of jobs and housing to go, our key corridors as well, and the neighborhoods where we live, work, play, shop, and send our kids to school. Also, as part of Envision Eugene, we had this, in addition to studying jobs and parks and schools, we had to look and see how much land we would need for the next 20 years for housing, both single family and then multifamily as well. I don't expect you to be able to read this. I see you kind of squinting. I'm going to turn the lights off in the front. Would that help, folks?
Yeah.
Okay. My screen is really clear, but I'm noticing maybe not so much on that one. So ultimately, it was determined that we did not need to expand the urban growth boundary for housing, and that we were going to rely on the existing lands within our urban growth boundary to meet our 20-year need. This map represents our 20-year land supply between 2012 and 2032. So you can see the lands that are highlighted in bright yellow, those were the vacant single-family lands as of 2012. And the oranges are the kind of the vacant multifamily lands. And then what you probably can't see are some that are outlined that are kind of partially developed lands, and we're also anticipating that those would be further developed. So these lands, plus downtown and our corridors, is where we're anticipating the 15,000 new homes to occur between now and 2032. So as part of Envision Eugene, Council gave us some pretty specific direction related to housing, and this was around a conversation about what population forecast we needed to be using to accommodate this growth. So they made a determination to stick with the population forecast that we were using, but added kind of some additional stipulations upon that. So first they said, go ahead and adopt that urban growth boundary, that baseline urban growth that doesn't expand for housing, but expands for the other uses. Update the needed housing regulations, I'll get back to that in a second. Establish urban reserves, which would be areas outside our urban growth boundary where we're gonna target for future growth beyond the 20 years. And then they also asked that directed that we start a monitoring program and then figure out if we need to take action as part of that monitoring program. We have adopted the baseline urban growth boundary. This particular project is actually the needed housing update. That's what it was called in 2015. We've changed the language to be more consistent with state law. Janessa can tell you a little bit more about that later. For those of you who are big-time meeting junkies, feel free to get involved with Urban Reserves. That's also a project that is underway, and probably some of you are involved in the monitoring project already. So there's plenty of opportunity to be had if you have other interests just beyond housing. So the clear and objective, this is what council directed us, that we needed to update the city's procedures and approval criteria for needed housing applications. So really it's just housing applications. And then target for city consideration, basically 1 year of state acknowledgement or approval of our urban growth boundary. And so that happened in January of this year. The state said, okay, you're good to go with your urban growth boundary. And that's what led us here to where we are today. Just a couple of reasons why for the update. One, as I mentioned, we're going to need to accommodate 15,000 new homes by 2032. And we need to make sure that our land can accommodate that our regulations are going to be efficient, and that we don't lose the things that we love. Also, legal challenges have affected our ability to address certain issues. We've actually lost a couple of criteria because of legal challenges, and we can no longer apply those. And then finally, our approval criteria have been perceived by some as barriers to providing housing, and there's been concern that they don't line up to maybe some of the assumptions we had when we analyzed our residential land. And others folks feel that the criteria don't do enough to address neighborhood livability. They don't address those things that we really care about when it comes to growth in our neighborhoods. All right, so now I'm going to transition to the land use process. Some of the feedback that we've been hearing as part of the Clear and Objective update is that we need to provide more education about the land use process. So in response, I'm going to be providing you a high-level overview tonight. I recognize that there are a fair number of you in this room that this is going to be totally review or old hat for. Feel free to check your phone, stretch, drink your water. That's fine, I won't be offended. For others, I'm going to apologize because it's probably not enough for some of you either. So maybe it'll hit somebody just right, like Goldilocks, but if not, follow up. If you have more questions, we're happy to talk to you offline, talk to you, ask us questions. But one thing I do want to make clear, because there are a variety of levels of understanding of land use in this room, you do not have to be a land use expert to participate in this project. The only qualifications you need are a big heart, caring about our community, caring about housing, and a willingness to participate in this process. And for that, I thank you all for being here. So, speaking of vision, this is former governor Tom McCall, who was really one of the founding fathers of our statewide planning program. He was worried about post-war sprawl that was happening in the 60s and 70s, and really with a group of other folks kind of came to action, and that resulted in the passage of what's called Senate Bill 100, which happened about 45 years ago. And this set up our state's unique land use laws, which are aimed at protecting some of those things that we love most about our state, our farm and our forest lands, but also allowing us to still grow in prosperity and think about where we are going to have urban growth and where people are going to live and where the jobs are going to occur. So these things really are what make up our quality of life. It was really, visionary for its time, very progressive, and there's not many other states that have done something this bold since then. Not to say it doesn't have problems, but it is, it's the reason why when you drive up I-5, it's not just sprawl from here to Portland. You see farms, you see the hills that are forested, and it's not all being carved up into lots. So as our population is still growing, we do still enjoy a pretty amazing quality of life. And I know, for me, that's one of the big reasons why I've stayed in Oregon and stayed in Eugene. We do have a pretty amazing quality of life here. So getting into the regulatory, so what the statewide program, one of the things that it requires is that all jurisdictions have what's called a comprehensive plan. And this is really provides broad policy direction. So unlike our vision, which is very important, the comp plan is more of a regulatory document in a certain sense. And it provides broad policy direction again on housing, economic development, natural resources, citizen involvement, and other land use topics. We are special in that we have two. We have the Metro Plan, which is a regional comprehensive plan. We share it with Springfield and Lane County. And then we also have our own comprehensive plan, which is the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan. That was adopted just last year. And what I will say about that is we've been working with Springfield and Lane County to transfer pieces of the Metro Plan that are really more personal to each city into the comprehensive plan. Also, yet another project if you want to go to more meetings. And the other thing about comprehensive plans is that they're required to be consistent with the statewide planning goals, which I forgot to mention earlier. So as part of the statewide planning program, they adopted 19 statewide planning goals and require that all of our comprehensive plans be consistent with those. So those range from, maybe you've heard Goal 1, citizen involvement, Goal 5, natural resources, 3 and 4 relate to farm and forest, 15, greenway. So there's just a number of things that our comprehensive plan has to address. And right now we've got some of that in the Metro Plan and some of that in the comprehensive plan. One of the things that's also included in the Metro Plan is what is called the plan diagram, which is really, it's a graphic representation of the goals and objectives of our Metro Plan. It represents our land uses. I really kind of just consider it a blueprint for our land use. What are what are the future uses or the planned uses for the properties within Eugene? Kind of going down a layer, then we have a whole other series of adopted plans. We've got way more than 3. They're functional plans, refinement or neighborhood plans, and different special area studies. These really have policies that guide a variety of different functions. Public infrastructure, transportation. They also address maybe certain natural features or specific neighborhoods. Some of these are required by the statewide planning program. We're required to have the first 2 here. The first one is the public facilities plan. Again, that's all cities are required to have that. We're also required to have a transportation plan, which is the second one. I also threw up a picture of the South Hills study here, which I think at this point is our oldest special area study. It was, I believe it's adopted in 1973. And so we have a very long history in Eugene of having special area studies, neighborhood and refinement plans that really focus in on specific areas throughout town and their unique characteristics. Again, these plans also have to be consistent with the statewide planning goals and the comprehensive plan. So moving down a layer, you probably are at least somewhat familiar with zoning, and it's one of the ways that we implement, again, our policies and our land use designations. And in its most simple function, it divides the land up within our city to help decide how that land can be used. And there's some pretty broad categories in the legend. Kind of the yellow that you see the most of, that is low-density residential. So I think it's slightly over half of our city is actually low-density residential, and then we also have commercial, industrial, public land, and a few other uses. So what zoning does is it kind of has 2 things, and that particular zoning map is implemented through our land use code. You may have heard it called Eugene Code. It's Chapter 9. And so zoning does a couple of things. First, it regulates uses. It says, okay, your land is zoned, low density residential. Here's your list of allowed uses. Here's also uses you can't do, and then here's some uses that may need additional approval, such as a land use application. I'll get to a little bit more on that in a minute. It also regulates development. So you're coming in for a building permit for your house. We're going to tell you, well, you need to be set back 5 feet from the property line. Here's your height limit. You need to be so far from the street. Your driveway needs to be, within this location. If you're doing multifamily, or apartments, your density can't exceed a certain amount. We also, have parking requirements. There's lighting and landscaping and access and stormwater and a whole host of development standards that apply through the zoning and land use regulations. So this is just an excerpt of our code, of the land use code. It shows the residential zones. I figured those were appropriate for tonight. And what it shows is it lists a number of uses, so one-family dwellings, accessory dwellings, row houses, and it says whether or not they're permitted with standards, or if they require something special like PUD or a site review. So if you wanted to know, if you knew your property was zoned based on the zoning map, then you can go to this list and within the code and see all the different uses that are allowed or not allowed in that particular zone.
Can you define what use is? I don't know whether everybody knows that.
I'm going to hold off on that right now. And then the next table is that I just pulled from the code are the residential zone development standards. And this is, again, just an excerpt. Unfortunately, the code's about 700 pages at this point, so just wanted to show you a brief sample. But this kind of also, again, shows for the residential zones minimum and maximum density, building height, and it starts to get into setbacks. And so for every zone in the code, there's the permitted uses or not, and then whether or not it requires a land use application, and then the development standards. So when is a land use application required? So there are a lot of uses that actually don't require a land use application. Again, you have a vacant lot, it's zoned just low density residential, you can get a building permit and put a house on it. And not go through any special approvals beyond that. Same with multifamily. There's a number of multifamily lots where you could just get a building permit to build your apartment. There are, however, kind of 5 general categories of things that may require you to get a land use application. The first is the use table, and so I'm just going to use residential as an example. So for instance, if I wanted to do a larger assisted care facility in the R1 zone, residential zone, it would require a conditional use permit. So that's based on use. Some properties have not just that base zone that we showed in the map, but they have a zoning overlay, like a site review. And if they have a site review overlay, any development on that property would be required to go through a site review land use application. So that's an additional process. Sometimes it's based on locational factors. So in the South Hills, so at above certain elevations, typically a planned unit development is required for certain projects. Land divisions always require a land use application. So even if you're just trying to carve off one lot, you do have to go through a process for that. Similar process if you're creating 100 lots, although maybe a little higher threshold of review. And then finally, they can also be voluntary. One example would be if somebody has wants to do a master plan or wants some flexibility, they can go through a planned unit development if they so choose. 5 main land use application types in the land use code. Let's see, each has a specific decision maker. So for instance, if you're going through a type 1 process, which the most common there is a property line adjustment. You want to sell your neighbor 5 feet, you do have to come through the city because there are a number of things we need to confirm or still being met, including lot size, density, make sure that you still have access to the street, make sure that you still have access to your utilities. But those are an administrative approval with no public notice, although all the information is available on our website. The other 4 types do have different kinds of public process. So the planning director, so type 2, we typically call those planning director approval. And tonight we're actually going to be talking about a couple of these land use types that are type 2s. These don't require a public hearing, but they do have public notice and an opportunity to comment. Type 3, so those can be conditional use permits, planned unit development, zone changes. Those actually go to a hearings official for approval through a hearings process. Again, there's public notice and an opportunity to comment and to appeal. Type 4, less rare, or more rare, I should say. That might be something like a site-specific refinement plan amendment, changing something in the refinement plan that's relates to a specific property. That actually goes to council. It does, again, have public notice and lots of opportunity to comment and an appeal period. And then finally, the type 5 is another city council approval, and that's a land use code amendment. Is probably the most common type 5. So what the clear and objective project will ultimately be doing in its final phase that Janessa will show you is going through the land use code amendment process. Land use code amendments, any changes to the land use code require city council approval through a pretty intensive process. So just wanted to point that one out. And then for each of these any land use application type, there's a specific set of rules and standards from the code, the land use code, that a decision maker must apply when making a decision. And these are called approval criteria, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I've just thrown up here the subdivision tentative plan approval criteria for needed housing. And so these are intended to reflect the community's vision. They're intended to implement the comprehensive plan, and they're also intended to meet state law as well. So it's actually this state law that requires that we have approval criteria for housing that are clear and objective, which is exactly why we're here tonight. Maybe that's a good transition to Janessa.
Thank you, Alyssa. So for the project overview, we'll begin with the project goal, and then I'll cover what clear and objective approval criteria are, and then I'll finish with how the project is structured. So our direction, as Alyssa said before, is to update the city's procedures and approval criteria for needed housing applications, or what we now are calling the clear and objective criteria. And our overall goal is to align these with our community's vision. As Alyssa mentioned, state law requires that the city adopt and apply clear and objective standards for housing. In Eugene, we have clear and objective development standards for projects that go straight to building permit, or what we call by right development. And then approval criteria for, like the example Alyssa just showed, for land use applications. So this project is, can you not hear? Sorry. So this project is focused on updating the land use application approval criteria for housing applications. For land use applications, the land use code has both a clear and objective approval path, and which we're trying to move towards calling it the clear and objective path, as well as a discretionary path, which we currently call the general track. So one of the identified issues in our key issue summary is to rename these tracks, and you'll notice that we'll predominantly use the terms clear and objective and discretionary. Applicants choose which track to go through when they apply for a land use application. The clear and objective path is intended to provide a predictable path to approval, since the criteria are not subjective, whereas the proposals that require flexibility, the discretionary track may provide that, but with the trade-off of maybe added uncertainty in the outcome. So cities must have clear and objective approval criteria for housing land use applications such as subdivisions. But what are clear and objective approval criteria? In plain terms, they are criteria that are measurable and not subjective. For instance, we're going to be tackling compatibility, neighborhood compatibility, as one of our issues. But we can't use a criterion that just says must be compatible with the neighborhood. That's too subjective, too vague, and you could get numerous opinions on what that would mean to different people. However, you can require measurable setbacks or impose building height limits. Those are clear and objective ways to address some compatibility impacts. So those are some of the suggestions we can look at when we go through those. As we go through the process of generating concepts on the issues, the clear and objective lens is something that we need to keep in mind as a requirement for any of the preferred concepts that we're going to carry forward. So I want to say a few things about the scope. First, Eugene's clear and objective housing approval criteria, such a mouthful, apply citywide. And so that means that this project also applies citywide. we're not able to do neighborhood-specific criteria as part of this work. To accomplish that would require a bigger process, like neighborhood planning effort, and like the one that's going on River Road, Santa Clara right now, if you're familiar with that. Second, the clear and objective update will encompass all housing types. It applies to land divisions for future single-family homes, multifamily projects that require site reviews or planned unit developments, and as well as, like Alyssa mentioned, assisted care projects that go on in residential under a conditional use permit. So there's many different housing types that are going to be affected by these criteria. And finally, council directed when they initiated the project in 2015 to update the procedures and approval criteria. So that's why the scope is limited to the clear and objective approval criteria and procedures. So now we'll get into the structure of the project. We're completing the project in 4 phases, each building on the previous. Phase 1 included project initiation, which was drafting the charter and the public involvement plan and surveying the key issues. We contracted with a consultant, Elizabeth Decker from Jet Planning, who performed an external land use code audit. And as part of that process, Elizabeth helped facilitate focus group sessions back in June. And the information that we gathered from those, along with her code audit and additional feedback, were used to assemble the list of key issues. So the list was compiled into the summary of key issues report that you all have in front of you as part of the stack of papers that we gave you. So it's the one with the colorful print.
It's heavy.
The heavy one. And it's organized into 3 main sections. The first are the maintenance issues. So these are issues that represent policy-neutral procedural changes or amendments that bring consistency between the 2 review tracks or between other sections of the land use code or with state law. The second section is the significant issues for discussion. And these are the issues that raise policy implications and were identified as the focus of these working groups. The third section is the out-of-scope issues. So the out-of-scope issues address topics that are identified that may warrant being considered in the future, for sure, by the city, but can't be addressed within the scope of this project. These may have broader applicability, they may be too large in scale to address within our project and the tight timeline, or they may be being addressed through another project. As many of you know, you went to another meeting last night. And then I just wanted to say that these are important issues and we've captured them in the report, and they will be considered for future code updates through the code improvement program. So they're not lost on us. So phase 2, where we are now, is the concepts and evaluation phase. We're going to use the summary of key issues report that we have there to generate practical, clear, and objective ideas for how to address the issues. We'll also evaluate the potential concepts, and these working groups are really the engine of this phase. So thank you for serving our community by being here. Over the first 3 meetings, we'll evaluate each of the 20 significant issues that we have identified and come up with the goal of coming up with some workable solutions. Once we have the preferred concepts identified, a draft report will be produced and you'll have a chance to review and provide comments on the draft report, just like you did with the draft of the key issues. We'll present the draft report to the Planning Commission, who will be asked to review and refine it, and then we'll ask Council for their blessing before we proceed to the next phase. Phase 3 is where we take the preferred concept report and draft proposed code language to implement those concepts. So once initial draft language is complete, we'll again consult with the working groups, and then proposed land use code changes will be brought to the Planning Commission for review. I'm trying to hurry now because I know we're getting tight in time. So the result of phase 3 will be a preliminary recommendation to Council. We will bring proposed code changes to Council for their consideration to move forward with the formal adoption process. So the target for Council consideration is January 2019. This is also a good place to mention that we have heard from some that there's not enough time for this project. We've also heard concerns from others that having too much process can be a burden. And we will share those concerns with Planning Commission and Council at our next check-ins. However, I do want to say that we've set the project milestones up to meet the expectations of the project within the timeline we've been given. So now we have time for a few questions before we roll up our sleeves and dive into some issues.
We're gonna use the mic. Can you guys, that works. It really helps people be able to hear. And one thing I want to say is that I'd really love to hear from a variety of people tonight. And so in terms of questions, recognize that our time is valuable, and the more concise you are, the more that we can hear from everyone at the meeting. And let's spend some time, because we've just talked a lot and are done. So questions. Carolyn, I'm gonna run around. And I'll just hold it.
This question goes back to the very beginning of the introduction, but 6 years have passed since 2012 when the Envision Eugene was completed, and we said we needed 15,000, I guess it was, new units. So how many of those have already been built?
That is a good question. That's why we're underway of establishing the monitoring programs. I don't have that number for you tonight. I'm not sure that.
After 6 years, it hasn't been monitored.
Well, we didn't have an adopted urban growth boundary until January of this year. So I know, we've done a certain amount of monitoring, but our systems haven't been quite set up. So there's been an enormous amount of work in the last year to get the monitoring program underway so that we can meet the council direction, which I believe was have the first report within 3 years of the urban growth boundary adoption. That was the direction we were given.
Thank you. Who else? Kevin and then Paul. Oh.
So obviously the refinement plan for each one of the neighborhoods is the gospel by which all development gets done. I'm living in an area that probably has the most growth going on in the city. And I was wondering, if you're going to do this adopt or get city council approval by 2019, are we going to be able to make application with you to update our refinement plan that's over 20 years old now? And if this goes into 2032, it'll be 52 years old.
So we are working on a couple of neighborhood refinement plans right now. So the one that's the most active is the River Road Santa Clara, and that one is actually, there's maybe people here that are involved in it. There are a couple in the wings. One is the university area. They've been waiting, I don't know, a long time for that particular plan as well, not to downplay your neighborhood needs as well. And then behind that is Bethel, and those are what we've been directed to work on first. So part of it's a capacity issue. There's only so many of us in planning to do that. I do understand that there are a number of neighborhoods, particularly in Northeast, that you are seeing a tremendous amount of development pressure.
So is there an opportunity for us to do some preliminary homework as a neighborhood group?
Absolutely.
So we could get ready so that when our time does come, we have done our homework and our ducks are all in a row.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the things that River Road Santa Clara did, and so that would be fantastic. If you want to follow up with me later, I can hook you up with the right people for that, and that's we strongly encourage that, so that was fantastic.
Just a quick follow-up. Might check with the people in South Willamette and get their advice on how to go about that, because they do a lot of work. It appears that what we're working through, and tonight is just part of it, is the 20 items that were identified as significant items 1 to 20, CRS 1 to 20. You asked for the community to respond to the whole list, but I don't see that anything happened with those responses, some of which were that things should be shifted in or out of those categories. And to me, it seems like we've skipped a huge step here in that the community hasn't had a chance to say, well, that's not really that significant, or that's not a maintenance issue, it's bigger than that, or whatever. So can you clarify what you have going on?
Yeah, we did receive feedback, and Appendix D, on each of your tables, there's a copy with a little Bulldog clip that's got the 4 different appendices that go with the summary of key issues report. And so we gave a 2-week period to get feedback, and we received feedback from a few different people. And so Appendix D is a compilation of all of the feedback we received. We did add 1 issue from the feedback that was received. There was 1 issue that was suggested as a new issue, but that really there's 3 separate issues that kind of get there. So it wasn't added as a separate issue. And we, at the end of the introduction of the final report, we kind of talk a little bit. The vast majority of the feedback that we received was really added commentary and kind of opinion on the issues and not necessarily requiring movement. And we can't change the parameters of the scope within, as we've identified it.
Can I just ask you how many parties responded?
3 people, but thoroughly.
The other thing I'd say is that in addition to these meetings, Janessa and Alyssa will have office hours. That was my turn, but dedicated time in the office, stop in and go through. So if there's follow-up on specific issues that people are wondering about, that is a great time also.
Thank you for mentioning that, Julie, because I really wanted to point that out tonight, that I will send out an email to the IP list soon that will give you, we have 4 different days between now and the final session that Alyssa and I will be available to do kind of office hours, a couple in the afternoon and a couple in the going into the evening, and where we'll just be available if people want to drop in and ask more questions about the land use process and about this process. We'll be there, and Julie's hopefully going to be there too. So,
and if the time doesn't work for you, just let Janessa know and she can follow up with another time. John.
I may have missed it for this meeting, but for the future meetings, can you publish in advance which issues will be on the agenda? Because it helps a lot to know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we did send that out barely in advance, and we were cramming to identify issues that weren't too overwhelming for this first meeting. Other questions? This table's quiet. Here.
I'm not very educated on this topic, but so this question might be sort of basic. But the clear and objective criteria that you come up with, you say it's going to be citywide. So it's not going to be specific to different neighborhoods. I mean, are they going to be the same setback? Are those kind of numbers going to be the same, or the same method of coming up with those measures are going to be consistent citywide? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so there's development standards that apply citywide regardless of the neighborhood that you're in, and then there's special standards based on zoning in some neighborhoods. These criteria, they're not gonna mess with the kind of base zone setbacks or those standards. We may need to implement a special setback, say in different situations, like transition buffers for if you've got a multifamily project coming next to a single family neighborhood. That's an example of where maybe there would be a special setback that would apply based on that circumstance, that condition versus because of the neighborhood it's in.
That's a good question. Other questions? Paula.
A weedy question, but you showed us going to City Council in January, so I just want to back up a little bit in terms of understanding public process. So there's what we're doing basically through the end of October. And when will Planning Commission see this? And I'm thinking that would they then be having a discussion and a hearing on whatever staff takes to them?
Oh yeah, I apologize. I was rushing so much I forgot my last 3 slides where I was going to talk about the legislative process for the formal adoption. For the November check-ins, so we're going to be doing this project. Our last 3 meetings are going to be in October. We just couldn't get the scheduling to work for most of September. So we're going to get through the bulk of the issues on the next 2 meetings, and then the 4th meeting, as Julie mentioned, will be kind of the compilation where we'll hopefully have gone through all 20 issues, have some concepts, and then have you guys weigh in on kind of the preferred concepts that we, what we should carry forward. Then we'll be going as well to Planning Commission and then on to City Council with the preferred concepts before we proceed to drafting proposed code language. So there won't be a hearing or anything at that point, but we do plan on coming back to working groups or sending things out to the IP list when we have that preferred concept report ready.
A couple more.
Just real quick, the formal adoption process doesn't end January. It actually starts after that, just to be clear.
So we got time. A couple more questions, and then we're going to go to the first issue.
Well, this isn't really a question. It gets back to Carolyn's question. I believe there was about 6,700 multifamily units projected for the next 20 years. Through other work, we know that almost all of those have already been built. So I don't know how this affects things, but we've known this for a couple of years now. So I know in 2017, at least 75 to 80% of the multifamily homes have been built, and there's been some built since then. So I think we're pretty close to the 67 already.
So I don't know the exact numbers of that. I would have to ask some of my colleagues there. They're not here tonight, but I will say that these particular standard criteria that we're talking about tonight they are required to apply for any housing. So regardless of if it's, if it's 67, 101, if it's that last house, they're still entitled to clear and objective standards. So, but I know that you're actively involved in the monitoring, so more to come on that.
Last question? I scared you. Okay. Before we go on, we're gonna talk about emergency management, preparedness, response. Good thing I'm not presenting. But before we do, feel comfortable getting up. The bathrooms are down the hall. And after the presentation, before we start small group conversations, I'll just briefly give you some direction for your small group. So I can pass it back to you.
We're actually going to work through about 5 issues tonight, 2 categories. So the first 2 we categorized as kind of the emergency response, and then we have Amy Linder from the Fire Marshal's office back here with us as kind of added experts support tonight. So the first 2 topics that we're going to kind of go into in our group sessions, I'm going to cover both of them briefly up here, and then we'll break out into some table groups. So the first issue is emergency response. So this was described as one of the clear and objective track for conditional use and planned unit development and site review applications don't include a criterion for protecting emergency response. Actually, let me go back here real quick. There's a little bit more I want to say about this. So this boils down to access and water. So in a fire or medical emergency, the ability for the crews to get their fire apparatus to the site is a key part of a fast response. In the event of a fire, closely located hydrants with adequate water supply is necessary to successfully control and put out a fire. So during the initial planning of a new housing development, the Fire Marshal's office reviews the plans and provides information to the developer of the requirements for water and access based on the Oregon Fire Code, Chapter 5, Fire Service Features. And for fire apparatus, this could include height and width of access roads, the turning radius or grade, and fire lane signage. For fire hydrants and water supply, the Fire Marshal's office works closely with EWEB to ensure that the water mains can meet the Oregon Fire Code's fire flow requirement, and that when installed, the hydrants are spaced and functional for use when they're needed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd like permission to correct something you said.
So we're going to wait. Well, we're not going to interrupt the presentation. So when it's done, we'll follow up.
So here's the discretionary standard that applies to site reviews, conditional use permits, and planned unit developments. So right now, even though we don't have a criterion for the clear and objective path, this review from the fire marshal's office already happens and takes place. So the question is, one, is it necessary to have a criterion? And two, if we need a criterion, how do we turn it into a non-subjective standard? So, Amy, do you have anything to add to that, or anything else you want to put in?
No. Okay.
So just to clarify, as part of a land use application process, one of the things that we do when we receive an application that's complete is we send over a copy of it to the fire marshal's office, and they review it for compliance with the fire code. For, I think, all land use applications, if I'm correct, at least the ones that we're talking about tonight, and then they respond back to us. They also review building permits, and hopefully developers go to them first before they actually submit their land use application to make sure that they meet fire code requirements as it relates to access and water supply.
Can we, I'm gonna just let Janessa get through these, and then we'll definitely do a Q&A. If you just jot it down. How many are under?
Just one more.
Just one more.
One more
Excellent.
to give you a little primer, and then we can split into the groups. So the other issue is we commonly refer to as the 19 lot rule. So this has to do with motor vehicle dispersal, and this is a standard or a criterion that has been struck down by the Land Use Board of Appeals, or LUBA. LUBA ruled that dispersal is not defined and is used in the 19 lot rule could have different meanings. It's ambiguous when it's used in this context. They also noted that there is a lack of clear purpose for the standard. We included it in with emergency response because it's our understanding that it's based on an old fire code standard. Although that standard is no longer in the fire code, there's a similar one that requires 2 separate and approved fire access roads or sprinklers when over 30 dwellings for 1 and 2 family developments, or over 100 units in a multifamily project are proposed. So that's the kind of background on this issue. Did you want to add? Okay. And this is the original code text for the criteria.
Yeah, let's do some group Q&A, because I feel like I need help. This is wonky. I don't know. And Eric.
So, excuse me, I want to keep this brief, but I would be glad to supply you with 2 recent fire marshal office reviews, and they do a review. That's accurate. What is not accurate is that they do not report, according to the Eugene Fire Code, access road standards. Instead, they report sort of an intuitive kind of thing. So it's important to understand, I mean, this is a very important thing, because if people think that they're actually checking against those standards, they will be mistaken. And that's one of the problems. They do need to be checking against the standards. So I wanted to be sure that it's clear, because it was just blatantly not accurate.
Eric?
Yeah, I'm quite new to all things, but do I understand well? I would think like that accessibility for a fire, for emergency, needs to have an influence of your split a lot, because a lot of neighborhoods like where we live, the firemen couldn't reach houses when we kind of allow people to put secondary housing in those backyards. So I would think it will have a specific influence on your whole zoning when you, so it's not just like the fireman will check before the permit is given, but it needs, I would think it needs to have influence on your zone in general, because the accessibility for fire and for the engines, for the cars, is very bad in the neighborhoods the way they're built, and it's good that there's one house, but not when we allow developers to make a row of other houses behind.
Want to comment on that?
No, I mean, I think one of the reasons we are collaborating with the fire marshal's office, and we have been on some more recent projects, is exactly that point. We know we're going to, have more housing. There's going to be some more housing in the city, and so we need to make sure that everybody can be served, and that is a very important point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just curious as if there was any reasoning behind picking these two to start with.
In part, it was trying to pick some categories that we could fit into tonight with the bulk of the presentation, taking up the first part of the evening. And so we have other conditions or other of the issues, like the ones that pertain to PUD requirements, that it makes a lot of sense to cluster them together so that we can dig into that. So in part, these were kind of, smaller, discrete clusters of issues that we could fit into tonight's menu.
Yeah, and we'll send out a schedule of all of the issues and when they're going to be at each meeting soon. Lord.
Since I assume most of us in the room are not experts when it comes to fire and water access, and since every application is reviewed by the fire department, is there over time kind of patterns of the bases for when applications are denied versus approved, or I should say recommended for denial or recommended for approval due to fire and water access?
Amy, do you have any response to that?
I don't have any stats.
Oh, hold on. Let me get you this. You can hear you.
I don't have any statistics in terms of what basically our process is, we do the review, we make our recommendations back to land use, and their process continues. So a lot of times, and I'm actually fairly new into this role, so that process has gone on for years and is evolving as we continue to develop our relationship and better our partnership with them and deal with some of the issues, just like this gentleman mentioned about existing conditions. As the code changes, there's other factors that kind of play in there as well, but I don't have any kind of statistics in terms of approval or denial rates based solely on access and water supply.
Okay. We'll do a few more because I wanted time just to discuss at the tables as well. But this is helpful actually to me so far. So,
You mentioned that there was a new fire. The original rule here was, the first one was based on, for this 19 rule was based on some language in the fire code which was changed to the new language. Is that new language in the current land use code that requires sprinklers?
So it's not in the land use code. It's actually part of the fire code. And I think Janessa referenced it's now like a 30 lot rule or a 100 unit rule that basically requires secondary access. So that's the fire code. I will mention that we do have street connectivity standards in the land use code that also require secondary access under certain circumstances. So there is some overlap there, and it talks about secondary access for emergency response. So there is already at least one place in the land use code that addresses that particular issue.
There's no direct requirement for that, for those conditions to be met. For example, sprinklers if the size of the...
No, not in the land use code. We don't tend to try to pull in other.
But you did it in this case.
Apparently we did. It was a long time ago, so I don't have all of the history. I'm kind of going more on what we've been told by some of our long-standing staff.
So if fire code already speaks to water and access, why would planning code need to speak to it also?
Well, that is actually one of the questions Janessa asked. Is this something so important that we should put it in here, or can we continue to rely on where it is, or is there something above and beyond what's in the fire code that should go in the land use code? Those are all really valid questions, and that's the reason why, the first thing is no change. Leave it the way it is. That was one of the suggestions. Or have a letter. You can look at the different concepts that we tried to brainstorm, and I'm sure there are many others.
Yeah.
Taking a few minutes this evening to look at these first two issues, these are low-hanging fruit. I would say these are very easy ones for us to begin, as a group, begin to develop an understanding of the task before us over these next 4 meetings or whatever And if we're gonna if these are gonna stay as criteria, and if they're going to be clear and objective, there's, as you said, it's very well done in your summary report, that there are key phrases that need to be either removed or defined. For example, in emergency response, in the criteria, the two key phrases is, number one, significant risk, what the heck is that? And number two, impediment, what the heck is that? So and then again with the 19 lot rule, the key phrase is dispersal. So if these particular criteria survive, I think as we move forward as a group, we're going to be able to find specific words or groups of words that are clearly not clear and objective, i.e. discretionary. And we're either going to need to define them or remove them in order to have a clear and objective standard.
Exactly, yeah. And I just want to say really quick, because I know we want to get to the table things, but the range of comments and kind of questions that are coming up show exactly why we wanted to kind of mix and mingle the tables to get kind of a little bit more intimate exposure to different perspectives and stuff, because we do have among us people who work with the development or the approval criteria when they're designing projects. We have people who are, in neighborhoods and know the impacts and the concerns and stuff. So this is kind of that, what we wanted to generate. So I'm actually glad to hear you. I don't realize, this was just intended to be kind of a primer to the issue, and hopefully this will also make a little more sense. We haven't gone through one little thing, and I think that once we get in our groove and everybody understands what the exercise is going to be, it'll kind of come together a little bit better.
Yeah, this is educational, though. I think it's a good primer for the conversation. So just one or two more questions, and then we'll break into the small groups. But you're both facilitators, and so that's why I'm continuing this, because you have the answers, and yeah, I don't have all the answers.
Okay.
Well, if you think this is low-hanging fruit, then I think we're seeing how complex even the simplest issues are going to be. For example, if the fire code is now going to be superseding the land use code, we should have a copy of what the fire code actually does say now that we realize that. Perhaps we didn't realize that before. But we need, is the mic really loud enough? Can you hear? Okay. So we should have it appears now we should look at the fire code if that's going to be driving this, and we're going to just defer to the fire code. How specific and clear and objective is the fire code? I kind of doubt that we're going to find the kind of definitional aspects that we need. Let me give you a very specific example very quickly. The Capitol Hill PUD.
Can I stop you there really quickly? I'm so sorry, Nathaniel. I know that
we can give you an example.
We do have a planning commissioner in the room tonight, and we can't.
We can give you an example of what the problem is in connectivity.
So
I'm just going to ask that you generalize your commentary.
It's because
that's a question of
right. It's going to be it's a procedural thing.
I understand.
Okay, you do. Okay,
I understand that very well. So if you have a road that doesn't have a secondary access, what are you going to do about it? If the access is up and back, and there is no secondary road, that's a key problem.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the fire code. Do you want to comment on the fire code and its?
I want to comment real quick that we can provide copies of the two sections that address access and water. Amy did bring us some copies, not enough for everybody, and I don't want to get too in the weeds with everybody feeling like they need to jump into 10 pages of fire code in order to address this issue, because these concepts can be more general and higher level. If you take a look at the 19 lot rule sheet, for example, one of the possible solutions that we came up with was that we could require that they prove that they've gone to the fire department and to the fire marshal's office and had a review. So there are ways that we could, tighten up the process and ensure that that review is happening and that there's a connection with the fire code without necessarily adopting, multiple pages of fire code redundantly in the land use code.
Okay, any question by somebody who hasn't asked a question yet? Because we're going to break. Okay, Carmen.
But just to clarify, our objective with this work is to establish a clear and objective path that allows for the creation of housing.
Correct.
Thank you. Just wanted to check.
Phew. I should say, there are project goals up here on these display boards. How to be nice, process, come take a look if you want to. Everybody did turn off their cell phones, so I didn't have to say that. So what we're going to do in the small groups is, there's really two questions that I'm curious about is, what is your experience with the code in relation to these issues? There's people in the room that have had personal experience with this, or they've had experience in their neighborhood. And the second is, what do you think about the options that were jotted down that are on your list? And can you think of others that brilliantly solve the problem, which would be wonderful. So that's our goal. We are going to take a break after this and then start into the second issue a little while after 7. So we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes to discuss. You don't need to turn in the worksheets tonight at all. You can take them home, you can work on them, you can take a picture of them and text them to me, you can email them to the project, you can mail them. I'll put some contact information up there, but we really have pretty expansive time frame to work on this, and so don't feel pressured. And I'm going to have Janessa and Alyssa come up and talk about the second topic.
And the second topic is actually 3 different issues, but it's all about process. Let me grab my notes here real quick. So this is issue number 12, and this is about requiring site reviews. So if you remember, I mentioned for housing, probably the most common trigger for a site review is actually based on a zoning overlay. So a property may have a base zone of, say, R4 high density residential, but then it has a site review overlay, meaning that if somebody wants to build apartments, they have to go through a land use application process for that. In the clear and objective approval tract for a site review, the comment we received, or this particular issue, it stated that they're really limited in scope compared to the discretionary tract, and they largely rely on compliance with other standards. So, as I mentioned, lots of times multifamily projects are allowed outright and can go straight to building permit unless a property has the site review overlay. And so right now, what's being announced here is maybe there's not a lot of utility in our existing clear and objective standards when somebody's going through a site review, and it kind of just seems like a redundant review because it's the same standards we would review at the time of building permit. So I have a couple of things I want to, we have a little bit of resources for you. First of all, it's the map showing where we have site review overlay, and this is over the top of our buildable lands inventory. I'm not going to show it up here. We've got a copy for each table, and maybe we can wait until I get through all 3 of them, but we want to show you a map that shows the site review overlay throughout the city, and it's laid over the top of what's called our buildable lands inventory, which shows what lands in 2012 were vacant or partially vacant, meaning that they were somewhat developed and had potential development availability on them. I do also want to just briefly mention why a lot of these properties may have site review. This isn't always the case. Sometimes they have site review because the neighborhood plan or refinement plan said, hey, these multifamily properties really need site review so that we can evaluate certain impacts. Others, back a long time ago, what we used to do, because we didn't have specific standards in our code that addressed a number of issues like access, natural features, maybe you've heard Goal 5, we didn't used to have such robust multifamily standards, and so what we would do if somebody was rezoning a property to, say, to a high density residential, the city would attach the site review overlay so that those issues could be looked at through the site review process. And I also, on your table, there are the site review criteria for clear and objective. We didn't provide the discretionary, but what I will tell you, the main difference is that there aren't any compatibility standards, above and beyond the multifamily standards or just your standard development standards in the site review section. So that was kind of one of the things we've heard is that, well, what's the, kind of twofold. What's the point of going through this if I'm just having to meet standards that I would have to meet anyway? And then on the other side, there's no extra compatibility standard here. Do I need to add or to clarify? Okay, so that's site review. I'm going to kind of burn through all three of these, and then maybe we can ask some high-level questions before we dig into the table work, and your friendly planner at your table can answer questions, except for Julie. So, okay. So next, kind of related, a related issue that was raised is about the conditional use permit requirement. So conditional use permit, again, a land use application type, these require a public hearing. And similar to the site review, the clear and objective approval criteria are largely just cross-references to other standards in the code. In other words, other standards that they'd have to meet a building permit anyway. And so there's actually really limited provisions for consideration of compatibility, again, similar to site review. So I will also note that conditional use permits for housing are actually extremely rare. I think the instances that in the code that require a conditional use permit are assisted care, boarding and rooming houses, which we don't see too many. Maybe we'll see more though. Campus living organizations, and then single room occupancies or SROs. So those are the only uses, residential uses, that require a conditional use permit. Is that not true?
That is true, and I was going to point out that zero conditional use permits have
Wait.
Yeah, so I'll say it, I can say it.
She'll say it.
Okay, so I did a little research before this, and so since 2003, we've had 8 conditional use permits for housing projects. I think most of them were they were all assisted care. Oh, there might have been like one fraternity or sorority. And none of them took the clear and objective path. So of those 8, they all took the discretionary path, which was kind of interesting. I'm not really sure particularly why we don't, and we don't see a lot of these for, we don't see a lot of conditional use permits for housing overall, because in that time frame, we actually saw a total of 70 conditional use permits, but only 8 of them were for housing. So what you'll see on your sheets about this one, or some of the options are, well, maybe we need to add compatibility standards. Maybe that will help. But I think the other question is, why aren't people using the needed housing track? What is it about that that's not attractive to, somebody who wants to build an assisted care boarding and rooming facility? And then, kind of another option is, well, do they have to really go through a conditional use permit? Could you drop that down a level and have them go through a site review process instead? And so those are just kind of some of the options that are out there. You may have others. You may have other criteria that you think would be, or considerations that you think we should add related to that. And then, did you have something on that?
I would just say, I'd just point out that the reason to suggest to drop it down to a site review versus a conditional use permit is, if you remember back when Alyssa was describing the different land use application types, a type 3 process is what a conditional use permit is, which is a public hearing and a hearings official decision, versus a site review is a planning director decision where notice is sent out, testimony comes in, but a hearing is not involved. So it takes the rigor of the process down a little bit, which may be appropriate in this case.
Or maybe not. Yeah, and so the last one is, the last issue kind of in this bundle about process is, this was brought up about the planned unit development. So for housing applications that trigger a planned unit development, again, that's a type 3 process. It goes to a hearings official and it's appealable to the planning commission. Maybe that's not necessary or warranted because the approval is based on clear and objective standard. Do you really need to go to a hearings process if those standards are, not at all subjective? Could you just do that through a lower level application type? If it also triggers a subdivision, could you rely on the subdivision criteria, or could you require a site review instead? So it's really about kind of a level of process. Do we want to keep it up at, a type 3, a public hearing, even though the criteria are clear and objective, or do you want to drop it down, or are we missing, criteria there? So I also wanted to mention that since 2003, we've had 51 PUDs for housing, and only 5 of those went under the clear and objective track, so that's about 10%. Site review is actually the highest percentage of, in that time frame, about 37 of the housing applications went through the clear and objective track. So 10% of our PUDs have chosen to go clear and objective. Conditional use permits 0, and then 37% of the site reviews. Do you have anything to add? Okay. And I'm going to imagine there's going to be some questions about this one.
Yeah.
I wasn't raising my hand.
Oh, okay.
So this raises the issue of compatibility, and is this when we really dig into that, or is that going to get vetted at one of the future
We're going to vet that
sessions?
at a future date, but I think it's a good bookmark. If you, for instance, if you think that, we need to keep site review and add a criteria about compatibility, then I think that might even be on your yellow sheets now. So some of these are interrelated. It was just hard to have them all at once, but we are going to be talking about compatibility because that is an issue that was raised for site review and conditional use permits and planned unit developments as well. So good question.
Yeah.
That's very clear. But that's why you need to.
Brennan, everybody ready now?
Oh, Steve.
Yeah, other questions before we break?
Steve has one.
Steve.
Yeah, I just had a question about some of these conditional use requirements. Is there any difference whether the property, say with the first one, abuts, say, these multifamily housing types, are they about a single family? Is there any requirement change?
There's not, I don't think there is currently. There may be a little bit more setback depending on the zone, but that's really all there is. So there's not, the zoning transitions that the Planning Commission has talked about. And so that's actually an issue. Those are kind of concepts that would come up under compatibility, which I think we're talking about at the next 2 meetings. But I think, as I mentioned, it's a good thing to flag here if that's an important consideration for site review, conditional use permit, and PUDs, then we want to know that.
Same thing for site review. Is there any requirement that's abutting lower zone property?
So in the clear and objective, there's not anything specifically called out. There's no special compatibility standards. They only are required, if it's multifamily, they meet the multifamily development standards and their base zone.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll talk in our small groups, and I would like to have a little time just at the end to reflect back as a large group before we leave. So we'll.
I do have a question about process. Vanessa said she's going to be sending us these ahead of time before the next meeting. I know a lot of people who wanted to be here and they couldn't take the time. If you send them to us, can we send them to other people to fill out and then they can send it to you?
Absolutely. So I will be sending out, Julie and I are working on getting an online participation component so that people can
If they can't be
enter
here, they
things
can still do
in,
it.
and that's why we're videoing these sessions too. We'll be posting the sessions, at least not our table work, but we will be posting the presentation pieces, and so people can watch those online and then do the online component, and you absolutely don't have to be here. And we want as wide a participation as we can get, so freely distribute links and stuff in the website. So I'll again send out an email to the interested parties list soon, and that will have that information. And definitely we'll have the rest of the forms ready. They're already pretty much done. We just only brought the ones for tonight. Good question, thank you.
Okay.
These seem like very light issues.
So imagine that we've got 60 by 150 lots, something like that.
I would love to spend just the last 8 minutes checking in, because my table had a few ahas. We had a lot of questions, and I think that's probably happened for all the tables. So I'm just going to take a moment. I'm going to run around with this, and I would love to hear some, concluding comments, something that as a table you all thought, this really makes sense, or how about that, or a fundamental question that you're like, wow, this is really hard. What do we do about this? And you can reflect on either the emergency response, but in my head right now is this last PUD conditional use site review stuff. So I'll stop. So who wants to go first?
So I'm feeling somewhat encouraged, because I've been arguing about some of this for years now, and at my table, I see people finally getting what I've been saying for years, and I feel like it's going bouncing off a brick wall. So I'm encouraged. Yeah.
Bouncing off a brick wall.
I admit that I had some concerns about people's ability to listen with open ears, but I think that's been done extremely well this evening.
Thank you. Well,
One issue that we got was that we really need to kind of visualize the difference between one person's barrier to being able to do things might be pinching somebody else. So it's really interesting to be able to try to see what the options are.
Yep. Yeah. How about you guys? What happened over here? You're having a good time.
We have such a tiny group.
I know.
If we had any aha moments, other than just speaking for myself, I thought, why would anyone not want to put in compatibility issues? I mean, to me, if you want to have a tasteful, viable city or neighborhoods, of course you want compatibility. How you put compatibility into a clear and objective format is a challenge, which luckily we didn't get to tonight. But I mean, compatibility, I think, is what we're after, right?
So you'll come back.
I'll come back.
This is good.
Compatibility and
How about over here? You guys have a big table. Any thoughts?
I don't know if we had an aha moment. We had, most of our discussion was on site review, so we didn't get to the other two.
Well, tell us a little bit, like, what were you talking, I mean, we had some site review questions, and then we talked a lot about it. What did you guys?
Well, we did have some site review questions, and I think the general consensus was that we didn't understand, looking at the map and seeing where there are site review overlays, we didn't see the necessity of a site review for housing. We felt as if it went the other way, and it was more important to have a site review for non-housing development.
Yeah, we kind of thought that too, but then, yeah. Jan, do you want to share a little bit some of your thoughts with that?
Yeah, it looks like a lot of the site review that is on the map was adopted before there were other criteria and other regulations that now address those issues. So a lot of the site review actually is redundant. So our suggestion was, well, the staff should just go back and look at each of the parcels that has site review overlay on it and see if it still makes sense, or if it's just an historical anomaly that we can eliminate. I think Alyssa didn't like that idea.
Well, no, I like the idea, it was just the thought of going through each one.
We just created a whole nother load of work. I think our table would agree with that.
Yeah. Sorry. No, I think it's a great idea, and I mean, it's something we've actually.
Somebody should do it.
Somebody should do it. I'm gonna give you each
Not you,
a map and tax
That's
map to look up, and then you tell me the history, and then we'll do it that way.
We divide the blocks and we all buy some.
Yeah.
Other thoughts from this table? Anybody else?
That sounds good.
Excellent. No, Mary, that is not true. You have a lot of thoughts. Well, I want to give just, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I just really appreciate the patience of people answering my question.
Yeah, I learned a lot tonight, for sure. Alyssa and Janessa, do you want to just make a few concluding comments? I want to make sure that people understand how to contact Janessa. So maybe, can you just write your email up here? She is the project email. There's no info at. This is the woman. And your sheets, you can take them home. You can, did I say this already? Email, text, I can put my phone number up if you want to do that. That's my go-to lately. And we'll be emailing out the online. And do you want to make any concluding?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, I feel like we have a really, really thorough website up. And so if you haven't visited that yet, I would love it if you would take a look and give me feedback if you have suggestions. I'm trying to get documents up they're on there right before I click the send button on the IP email list that I communicate with you all with. And so definitely watch that. I've got the dates of the other 4 meetings in the sidebar, so it's right there. So if you forget and you don't want to dig through all your paperwork or your emails to find it, go to the website real quick and you can find out a lot of that information. And the agendas and the packets will be on there, so you will get to see the remaining topics, the suggestion, the kind of seed concepts that we've put on those. And so you can be working on things ahead of time if you want, or just kind of seeing what they are and taking the time to dig into the summary of key issue report for more background. And then Alyssa and I will be doing the office hours, as I said. We've got 2 of them that are roughly 11 to 1 in case people can run over for lunch hour or something, and then there's 2 of them that will be 4 to 6 p.m. And they'll be drop-in, no RSVP. We have a conference room in the atrium building on the 2nd floor that's big enough to accommodate a pretty decent-sized table. And you can just come in and out, ask us questions, and we'll try to dig into some of this, because there are a lot of these questions that I know we went through at the table that I would love to get into with more time and really, help people and have a better understanding and feel more comfortable with participating in this process. Because the more people who participate, the better this process will be. So, and again, freely distribute the flyers. This is not a limited group. I want as many people to come as possible. And email me if you have any questions, or call me. My phone number is usually on the email, and I'll make sure I email you all really soon. We're going to get the video of the session up as soon as possible, so that people who couldn't make it tonight can also see what they missed and what their family missed. So thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming.
And then to the north, interior part that was parking lot and a grassy field, and we put $10,000 in. So if you